So thanks you guys for having me. And yes, I do apologize. I'm going to have to scoot when I'm done. I'd love to stay on for the rest of the call. Um, but I've got kids running in a state qualifying cross-country meet. So I'm going to go run to watch them run right after this. But I've spent my whole career looking at soil and water conservation. So I'm super jazzed to be with you all today. And we have many experts in this virtual room. So feel free to chime in or ask other folks questions too as we go along, or we've got lots of expertise here. So, but with that, I'll just sort of jump right in. Cover crops is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I do spend a lot of time in my current role training about like regulatory compliance. So it's always super exciting when someone asks me to talk about cover crops because that's fun. So I am Kirsten Workman. I'm an extension associate with ProDairy at Cornell College of Ag and Life Science. I'm also partnered up and housed with Corrine Ketterings in the Nutrient Management Sphere program. And that's probably how you know me best. But prior to coming to Cornell, I spent 10 years working in Vermont and did a lot of hands-on implementation of cover cropping, reduced tillage, manure injection systems with our farmers over on the other side of Lake Champlain. So let's see if I can get my slides to move the way they're supposed to. Okay, so there's lots and lots of reasons why we cover crop. I've listed some of them here, right? But I think the better question that we should be asking ourselves and others and producers in particular is really, why wouldn't you cover crop, right? Like, and hopefully I can convey in my presentation today beyond the science piece, the kind of practical application piece that while cover crops aren't simple, they are complex and challenging often. We have lots of tools to help manage that complexity and address those challenges. We've got lots of tools in our cover cropping toolbox. Today, I'll mostly focus on the sort of nutrient, soil, water side of things, just for time, and also since that's sort of our focus here in this group. And again, I just want to share, right, like I think we've all seen this situation in our fields, not the picture of soil health by any means. And when we see that sort of gully erosion, clearly a water quality implication. And in my time in Vermont, I saw the majority of fields go from this situation to this lovely picture, which is actually a picture taken in Bristol, Vermont in November of all months. And I think we could say that's a pretty good catch. And so we saw huge adoption over there. Of course, we have a much smaller population of farmers and a smaller state, so the word spreads a little bit quicker, but I think we're seeing the same sort of revolution here in New York as well, but lots of room to continue growing this practice. So what we'll cover just a little bit today, I'll talk a little bit about the how cover crops protect soil, nutrients, and water, sort of the mechanisms behind that. And then the key thing I think is really important is, okay, well, if they do all those things, I think we've all seen some great cover crops and some not so great cover crops. So how do we maximize these benefits of the practice? A little bit on implementation. I could spend days talking about sort of the hows we implement cover crops. There's, like I said, many people here in this group that have expertise in that as well. And I mentioned that there's plenty of challenges, but I like to think about those as opportunities for solutions and troubleshooting, and then just some real basic resources as we move along at the end here. Feel free to interrupt me too. I can't see anyone's faces, so just unmute yourself and interrupt if you have a question. So I think the first question is sort of, sort of how do cover crops work, right? So many of you already know this, but we'll just kind of all get on the same page. Here in the Northeast, the primary cause of erosion is precipitation. So we see rainfall hitting soil. Those raindrops, the velocity of the raindrops and the force of that water hits the surface of bare soil. We see detachment of soil particles and aggregates, and then those can be transported down slope and then deposited either in lower portions of the field or sometimes eventually into our waterways. And of course, we know that with our increased storms that we're experiencing here, increased intensity of storms that we're experiencing here in the Northeast, right, that creates an even more erosive event when we see these really heavy, hard rainfalls happening. And we're getting more rainfall and in less events. And I think that's really driving increased erosion and nutrient challenges here in New York and beyond. And as we all know as well, right, we have nutrients attached to those soil particles. And so when those soil particles leave our field, they take those nutrients with them. And so, you know, how does that work? Well, cover crops, then I kind of talk about them as armoring the soil, right? So those leaves sort of cover the soil surface. They literally intercept raindrops and disrupt their force and erosiveness. So as a raindrop hits a leaf of a cover crop, right, it dissipates that energy, kind of spreads apart. That allows the opportunity then for that moisture then to soak into our soil. It also reduces the velocity of runoff from a physical standpoint, right? So if we have cover and diversity across the surface area of the soil, that rain then slows down. Even if it becomes runoff and doesn't soak into the soil initially, it can slow down the flow of that water. And again, just like a buffer, right? Increase the opportunity for infiltration. And then we can't forget about our cover crop roots, which are really holding soil together to resist that disaggregation and provide structure and allow for that infiltration and literally holding those soil particles on our fields. And just a little bit of this is just some quick looks. So this is in Kansas, and, you know, a very different climate, right? But same results. Dr. Nelson there did a study just really kind of quantifying the reductions to erosion. And you can see from year to year and in both corn and soybean systems that we see, you know, huge reductions in erosion you know, upwards of 60 to 70% sometimes if we look at our systems with and without cover crops. And so less sediment leaving our fields with runoff and less runoff leaving our fields in general. So this is just a really great example too. So we often think of winter rye, which I think is like our the cover crop, the official state cover crop in many places here in the Northeast, and it does a great job. But if you think outside the box, even having a fall planted winter kill cover crop can provide some of those same benefits. And this is just one picture from Nebraska, but this picture is actually mine, and this picture was taken in a field in January, actually. And so you can see if you get enough cover crop growing before it dies off, it's still going to be protecting and armoring that soil and reducing this erosion that we see. So even though, and this is a forage radish situation, even though those leaves look like they've disappeared, right, they've done a really good job of protecting the soil. And then we still, of course, have roots there. And just a sidebar, right, we also see a little bit more weed pressure in those systems as well. This is a combination of oats and rye and radish that was planted that fall. So then we got to think about nutrients, right? So I spend a lot of time these days looking at that in terms of how do we do the best job to really recycle our nutrients in the best way possible. So cover crops are a really important tool in that, right? So we think of our kind of grassy cover crops, whether that's annual ryegrass, our winter and spring cereal grains. Those are really scavengers of excess nitrogen. So if you think about nitrate in the soil profile at the end of the fall or in the early spring, that was available maybe from what our cash crops didn't take up or because of manure applications or otherwise. Those grassy cover crops do a really fantastic job of pulling up and scavenging that nitrogen and holding it into the system and hopefully making it available to our crop later on. Because cover crops protect, I should say, we also, right, we have fixation. So our legumes actually are fixing atmospheric nitrogen and creating it into a plant available form in those nodules associated with the roots of those cover crops. Which help the cover crop itself grow, but then as we terminate that cover crop, will also help the crops that follow it. And then, of course, when we reduce soil loss, I already explained we reduce nutrient loss. And so the more soil we keep in the field, the more nutrients we leave in the field. Also, again, during that scavenging process and having a good diversity of nice, healthy, deep-rooted plants, we can reduce nitrogen leaching down through our soil profile into groundwater. And then having a good diversity, right, will just sort of impact our nutrient cycling. We see some crops like our deeper rooted brassicas might be pulling up things like calcium or phosphorus, where we see those legumes and grasses really playing an important role in nitrogen. And then, of course, as we build organic matter and biology, right, we can really start to drive and increase the mineralization of our soils, which is really, right, the biology is what's really making all that nutrient cycling happening. I do have one word of warning here that, you know, we need to be careful a little bit every practice has some pluses and minuses, and cover crops, there's some work out there looking at the role it might have to, with soluble nutrients. So one example of that would be total phosphorus and dissolved phosphorus. So while we know cover crops reduce total phosphorus losses from our fields, if you were to measure runoff and tile outlet discharges, we might sometimes see a shift to more soluble forms of those nutrients. But that's still, I think, an emerging area of science that we're trying to better understand. And I do feel like in our cooler northern climates, some of that timing works out better for us because we're able to, that doesn't really happen necessarily until we've got plants growing out there, because our soils warm up a little bit later, and by then we're like out there ready to plant the next crop. So just something to think about as we move forward. And I just wanted to share this with some work I did where we planted 1 million different cover crop plots on a farm's field. This is actually the aerial photo here on the bottom of my slide of these plots. These were planted in mid-August. We were sort of course, trying to maximize best case scenario for our cover crops. And we took some measurements in the beginning of October of that year. And just to share that, fall is an important time when we think about our cover crops. And I just wanted to show sort of the difference in nutrient dynamics. So the green bars are nitrogen, total nitrogen in the cover crops as it was sampled in the fall. The orangish red bars are phosphorus, and the purple bars are potassium. Those gold triangles represent biomass in pounds of dry matter per acre, and then the blue dots are the cost per acre. And just to show you that winter rye, which we love so much and is so winter hardy, and does so well for us in the spring, right? In the fall, might not be our top performer, where something like a forage radish, right, really can shine in those situations. Lots of biomass, lots of nutrient retention, pretty low cost. And then we can start to look at these mixtures as well to see if we can understand better how they're going to be impacting biomass production, which I'll talk about here next, and as well as nutrient uptake. So just to show that we do get quite a bit, right? That tillage radish in the fall had 82 pounds of nitrogen per acre just in the above ground biomass, 7 pounds of phosphorus, and 76 pounds of potassium being held there in the field. So that's pretty awesome. And these were not fertilized. And then again, just another piece about soil biology. One of the things we think about is, how do cover crops impact soil biology? I'm also interested in how manure impacts soil biology. But I think we understand now better about that biological component of soil health being really, really important. And I think having a living, growing plant 365 days a year is really what we're doing, is providing habitat, right? Just like we need habitat for our wildlife, we need habitat for our soil wildlife, to provide all those components of habitat that we typically think of in our ecosystems. And just knowing and understanding that the more biological activity we have to go along with, we also need that physical and chemical soil health. But to have that whole picture, the more that we have, the more nutrient mineralization can occur. Any questions about that before I dive into sort of, how do we maximize the benefits of this practice? Okay. So when it comes to cover crops, when we think about ecosystem provision of cover crops, almost all of what we think of how a cover crop benefits soil health, water quality, nutrient cycling is all very, very linked to how much biomass we can create from that cover crop. So as we maximize biomass, we increase the nutrient retention of that cover crop. We reduce erosion by increasing the coverage of the soil itself. We're doing better at outcompeting weeds. We're building more soil carbon. We get more nitrogen credits available to us. All the things we think of as a positive from cover cropping do better the more biomass we can create. So that's really our job as practitioners, is how do we maximize biomass within reason, which I'll share later. And so some of the ways we think about doing that is the timing of planting primarily, but also termination, how we plant these cover crops. Is there an opportunity to provide fertility or manure to maximize biomass? We think about this all the time in our cash crops, right? If we don't fertilize a crop, it's not going to grow very well. We won't maximize yield. So should we be looking at that when it comes to our cover crops as well? Termination and termination timing does play a role. So we think about, when we plant our cover crops, increases biomass, but if we kill them early or kill them late, that also has some determination on biomass. Species does have a role to play. And last on my list I put here now is seeding rates. When I started doing this work 15, 20 years ago, seeding rates was on the top of everybody's mind, right? We think about that in our CS practice standards when we're doing cost share, what's the right rate. And while it is an important factor, and there's a lot of reasons you want to take it into account, when it comes to biomass, it is not the primary focus. These other ones really have far more impact than actual seeding rate, because plants are really good at being flexible and they'll fill in as they go. So timing, it becomes really important here in the Northeast. So we're typically using these cover crops. In this case, we're talking about a situation of, basically post corn harvest is our primary use case, but it could be any cash crop, right? We've harvested that crop in the summer or early fall, and we want to protect that soil going into winter and early spring. Now, we can move that around quite a bit, actually, if we're talking about cereal grain harvest in midsummer or vegetable cropping systems, and there's lots of little windows. But regardless, the time in which you plant the cover crop based on its phenology will be really important in maximizing biomass. So in this particular case, I'm talking about winter rye after corn. And you can just see that we don't want to mess around getting that cover crop planted. So you can see here, this was, early September, which I would say 10 years ago would have been a reach, but in the last few years, I think has actually been pretty accomplishable. We see statistically higher biomass production from that very early planting date. But then we get into sort of more realistic right here. So that anything with the same letter is not statistically different from the other ones sharing that letter. So as we get into mid and late September, right, that's a pretty safe place to be. We're looking at 3,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. So just about 1.5 tons. Up here, we have basically 2.5 tons. And then as we slide into October and November, right, we see another sort of shift down. And so getting into the sweet spot here and trying to accomplish that good timing can really impact our biomass, quite a bit. And here's just a visual representation of that, right? So this was a farm that wanted to harvest some rye as a forage crop. And so he just was trying it, and he was able to get this side of the field planted about 2 weeks earlier. He did use a little bit of a higher rate here, and this side of the field 2 weeks later. And you can see already in the fall, right, if we're looking to protect soil from erosion, this crop over here is going to be doing a far better job than the one over here. Now, come spring, those two, I would argue, caught up with each other, but in that late fall, early spring, that's a pretty sensitive time that we really want to be protecting for. And so this would be desirable. So how do we do that, right? So I showed you here, right? September 6th, September 12th. Those are good days to be planting cover crops, our winter cereal grains. That can often be super challenging when we're growing kind of longer season summer annuals like corn, soybeans, things like that. So what are some ways we can sort of, and this could kind of delve into the implementation part of my presentation, but how do we make that happen, right? And so looking at the system is important. So if we're just trying to shove cover crop into one system and not changing the system to accommodate the cover crop, we may not see the most success. And on the other side of that coin, right, we need to make sure that we're not asking farmers to subsidize the cover crop by reducing yields or impacting their bottom line either. And so this is just some corn silage trials I started doing with one farm in Vermont, because he wanted to see, like, okay, could I back off a few days on my days of relative maturity on corn without sacrificing yield so that I can get out there and plant my cover crop? And one of the benefits we found of this is, right, the other piece is you're out there harvesting your corn crop when weather's just a little bit better. And when we start to get into October, although this year would be an exception, sometimes we're kind of in the mud, which is also not good for soil health. So if we can be out there harvesting corn in September and planting cover crops life seems to work just a little bit better overall. But that to be said, that often what we find is unless you're up in this 120-day kind of long season varieties, or when you talk about soybeans, if you're getting into like group 3 soybeans here in the Northeast, you will see potentially some yield increase from that. But again, there's some other drawbacks of like a later harvest. But what we found is oftentimes it's more about the hybrid you choose than the actual days of relative maturity. Now, when you get down in the low 80s, this starts to drop off. And like I said, if you get up over 95 days or 100 days, really, it might pick back up. But you can see here that the biggest difference really is between hybrid and not necessarily between days of relative maturity. And here on this farm, we were able to get, 27.5 tons on a pretty heavy clay soil of corn silage harvested. I think it was the second week of September, which came pretty close to the average of these higher day maturities. And we even saw one of these 85-day varieties coming in at 24.5 tons. And this is in a county where your average corn silage yield is around 15 tons per acre. So just something to keep in mind is sort of adjusting that system. But I also like to remind folks, right, like the cover crop also won't grow if it's still in the bag. So there's perfect, and then there's we got it done. And I think we've all been in that world. And I still argue I've planted cover crops in November, and it's like, okay, what am I doing? Am I spinning my wheels here? But there is a benefit, right? So I'd rather have someone do it, even late than not do it at all. So, you can do a few things to mitigate for that. That might be a place where you up your seeding rate, make sure you use the right planting method, right? Let's not have perfect be the enemy of the good. So, okay, so I want to switch now into sort of planting method. This has a huge role to play when it comes to biomass too. I think we've all seen every different version of planting a cover crop. When I first started, it was essentially an afterthought. So we're talking, toss some seeds out there on the surface, walk away and hope for the best. We've seen a huge change in that over time. And I don't know, how many farms do you know now that have their own grain drill? And so I think that's becoming more and more common and sort of standard. But there's also a lot of diversity here. And again, I think I want to reiterate, while there's best case scenario, there's also sort of what's the best tool for this situation, and knowing where each of these tools and application methods, planting methods shine will be important as in your work with producers. And I just like to remind my producers and folks that I work with that we want to treat our cover crop like a crop. And when we do that, we're going to see better results. So this was just an accident. So this was a farm who had a prevented planting soybean, very wet field, didn't want to leave the field bare. So he took some of that soybean seed, he mixed it with oats and radish. He was able to plant it and then broadcast it. And then he was working in with a pulvomulcher. That's what you see here on the left. And then he lost a bearing and had to fix the pulvomulcher. And it started raining and the cover crop germinated, and he sort of missed his window on the rest of the field. And that's what you see on the right. Same field, right? There was fertility out there. He had hoped to plant soybeans. Clearly, you can see on this picture on the left, there was plenty of opportunity. And when we planted it and did a good job of incorporation, that cover crop took off. We had really great weed suppression, good nutrient recycling in a situation that wasn't ideal for the farmer. And he felt pretty good about that. On this part of the field, I don't know if you can see, but we've got yellow nutsedge, we've got ragweed. We do have cover crop, but right, it's not doing its best work in that particular situation. So I'm a big fan of drilling cover crops, and this is just one example of why. This is a farm that I did a lot of work with, and this is sort of side-by-side fields that I was in the field, these two fields right across from the farmer who was planting his cover crop on the same couple of days. So same farm, fields right next to each other on the same farm road. He was broadcasting and pulvomulching his cover crop in. I drilled, and then I used a three-way mix and drilled as well. And just using the Canopio app, if you aren't familiar with that, it's a pretty slick tool. You can download that app on your phone. You can measure percent green canopy, fractional green canopy cover with that. So it doesn't take into account your crop residue like your corn stalks and anything like that. You can see that turns to black and doesn't get counted, but it does give us sort of a relative comparison. And these two were literally the same seeding rate on the same day or day apart from each other. And while this looks good, right, I think anyone would say that's a good catch, and much better than if he had just broadcast. We're meeting that 30% threshold, which is a good sort of yardstick for percent cover in the fall, but we managed to up that to almost 70 on the field where we drilled. Add a little broadleaf in there, and we can really up it again up to even higher numbers like 80%. Okay. So again, this is actually work from my master's thesis, which I spared you all the slides. I think I only have a couple in here. This is the percent cover, and I had different seeding rates, and each of those seeding rates with and without radish. And I drilled them in and I broadcast them in, and then I covered all the plots with manure in the most case. And this is a measure of percent cover. And what you see here is the green bars are drilled, the navy blue bars are broadcast, and the control was no cover crop at all. And in some of my site years, there was actually no difference in percent cover from the broadcast cover crops and no cover crop at all. But where we were drilling here, and this is fall percent cover, all of our seeding rates, and independent of whether or not you included radish with the winter rye, we saw 70% pretty much cover in the fall, which is great. So again, another reason why I say that seeding rate may not matter if you've got lots of other things going for you. And then we saw the same thing here in biomass. So those same treatments, but with measured biomass just in the fall. And again, you can see by the picture there that the same treatments broadcast and drilled clearly had much higher biomass and percent cover. And here's the same thing, sort of looking at it straight down and then down the plots, both in the fall and the spring, two different situations there. So what about our crops like corn grain and soybeans, right? How do we do earlier timing there? So I think a lot of us have worked with folks doing some interseeding. It can definitely work, especially if you pay close attention to the details. So in this situation, this was grain corn, and they used annual ryegrass. This is soybeans with a sort of, I think it was a 2- or 3-way mix. It was annual ryegrass and some clover. And again, good timing, good moisture at the right time helps. You can get it to work for sure. This is some helicopter seeding we did with winter rye. And what you're seeing on the left here is where we used the drill right after harvest on September 25th, and the side of the field that was broadcast with the helicopter a few weeks earlier. So part of this is we were early enough in this situation, we may not have needed to interseed, right? Part of this too might be the species we chose. And of course, because we're flying things on into a crop, we're just gonna see this much patchier catch. But over here, we drilled it right after and we get that really nice drilled cover crop. So just, it's not always your best option, but it definitely plays a role. And one of the things we can take into account for that is our species. And so what we learned from some of these interseeding projects, these are broadcast into the standing crop at early and late and then drilled after harvest. Annual ryegrass does much better, right, than winter rye if we're going to go early. They're pretty close to each other in that mid-season, though I would argue that the annual ryegrass does a little bit better. I think winter hardiness might be an issue. In some places, all that seems to be becoming less of an issue. And then this drilled after harvest, right? Winter rye wins the prize. So just thinking about that. But that said, here is a farm in the Skinny Atlas Lake watershed, and they participated with their Soil and Water Conservation District on a drone interseeding project. So they were aerially applying annual ryegrass. Again, they chose the right species into standing corn. It got planted on September 9th, and these pictures were taken the next spring. And you can see we saw about 45% cover, which was nice. And he had fields, literally, we just walked down the road a couple notches, and the next field, they drilled some winter wheat right after harvest, so 924, a very decent seeding rate. And we see a decent catch, averaging about 33% cover. And then, and neither of these had manure. And then we see broadcast after corn silage on the same time, same crop. And it did get some winter applied heifer manure. And it was, again, sort of less reliable. You can see we have anywhere from 38% cover down to 13% cover, depending on which part of the field you looked at. But again, that broadcast piece just being a little less reliable in this situation, even after harvest. So in that case, the interseeding, right, did really well. So, okay. Here's another way we can interseed to try and maximize, right, again, that practice. This is a project, and these pictures are taken from Tom Eaton from Ag Consulting Services. This was the same three-way mix planted at the same time, broadcast, and then with one of these Penn State interseeders. And again, the only difference being planting method, and we see a much better catch under the corn canopy here than we do over here. And I chose not to bore you with all my pictures of cover crops I've dug up, and you can see the differences not only in their leaves, but also in their roots when we drill those cover crops, and they just really take off and germinate immediately. So I can't give any presentation really without talking about manure. Manure is awesome. And I really do believe that manure is one of those places where we have the most to gain when we think about pairing it with cover crops. This to show you the same different mixes of cover crop with and without manure. We saw higher percent ground cover when we apply manure after planting than without, which makes pretty good sense. And we see the same thing. This was a really late planted cover crop. I think I planted it on November 1st. It was hairy vetch and triticale. And you can see both fall cover with manure. And I think this was spring biomass was pretty much double when we used manure versus not using manure on our cover crop. So a lot to gain there, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then we have termination, right? So timing of termination, this slide is just to show you if we can maximize and keep that cover crop on the field as long as reasonably possible, we can see some increases too. So in a matter of 11 days there, we've got, I think, in May, we see quite a difference in termination timing and biomass of that cover crop. So just another factor. And just to reiterate my point about seeding rates, right? If we're utilizing cost-share projects funds, we need to make sure and follow those guidelines so that farmers are eligible to receive their payments. It is something we can use when we're thinking about later planting dates. You know, if you're looking to grow forage for harvest, if you're looking for really good weed suppression, if you're going to be doing some rolling and crimping or planting green, there might be lots of reasons why you might want to up your seeding rate. We also want to just make sure we're using really good seed, make sure it's certified seed, germ tested, and we're planting at Pure Life seed rates. That can be helpful. And just to say that, you know, fall planting dates, your spring termination timing, fertility, all will have a bigger effect on your total biomass, usually, than the actual seeding rate itself. So I'm going to dive real quick into implementation here. You know, these are practices, but really they work the best when we think about them as systems. And so the farms that I've worked with that have seen cover cropping as an integral part of their soil health system are the ones that have made it work the best. You know, I show this picture here of a bumper sticker that the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition put together, right? There's also this cultural piece and having it be part of your whole farm system, not even just your fields, but the people on your farm. You know, having the ability to be flexible, planning for success, not doing these things as an afterthought, getting fields where water management is in a good place so that they're available to do a lot of these practices. In my experience, I feel like cover crops are really the ticket to making our no-till systems work here in the Northeast. And again, we've talked about growing cover crops like a crop. And then I joke with farmers too who are doing these. If you're planting green into your cover crop, you might not want to look at your neighbor's fields until like August. So I always joke that we need to write a SARE grant where we paid for farmers doing this practice to go on vacation in July, so they didn't have to see how crazy their fields looked until they looked really great in August and the yields were awesome. So again, these are complex systems. We can't just shoehorn them into existing systems without adapting the whole system. And this is just one of these things that adds complexity. I always like to share this with non-farming groups that, right, we're asking farmers to do a whole nother system on, during a time of year when they're already really busy, right? We're harvesting hay, we're planting corn. Now we're asking you to also terminate a cover crop. We're asking you to plant your cover crop right when we're doing things like harvesting our cash crops or doing manure application. So just being mindful of where it fits into the system. And that's why I say often, as we start to look at the whole farm, can we look at labor savings in one area, opening up that labor to be able to help with things like cover cropping. And just to say again, right, we've got lots of tools in our toolbox. So making sure we understand which tool is right for which job. Just another reiteration about implementation of manure. So this is for me a win-win-win, right? As we apply manure to our cover crops, they're increasing biomass. That means we're reducing erosion, we're reducing nutrient loss, we're increasing that nutrient uptake. If we're applying fall manure applications anyway, which on most livestock farms we should be doing it in conjunction with a growing crop, right? Then we have all these other opportunities that come from that. So anytime we're fertilizing our cover crop with organic livestock manure, that's going to be a good thing in my opinion. And just to say that there's a lot of ways we can make this happen. This is a picture of a farm that injected manure that you can tell that they actually planted their cover crop this way, but can you tell that they injected their manure this way? And this was just a couple of weeks, I think, after planting. This picture was taken. We can also, this farm was actually injecting, they kind of did the injection in conjunction with their cover crop planting. They used that as their incorporation. And this farm didn't get their manure on before they cover crop, so they just planted the cover crop. The cover crop was up 4 or 5 inches, and then they injected through it. And those little injection furrows filled right in by spring. So lots of ways to fit manure in, surface, inject, incorporate, lots of ways we can make that happen. And here's just one really great example of totally adjusting the system where we've had farmers looking at these wide row solar corridors to actually change the corn system itself to enable the cover crop to grow better. So we did a look at 30-inch and 60-inch rows. We did learn you can make the cover crop look really good, but we still have some work to do on the corn side. But I will say that on this farm and this year, they had an early frost. They're actually chopping, not combining, but this was the only cover crop that really got planted on the farm that year, and it looked good. It looked good all winter. Again, too, looking and thinking about mixtures and species. So, I talk about challenges. This is not 2 pictures like Photoshop next to each other. These are 2 plots side by side, where this was the winter rye plot, this was the tillage radish plot. And then the farm no-tilled their corn right through it. And you can just see the nutrient cycling difference. And we learned a lot from this about how to manage nitrogen when we've got a high carbon crop like winter rye and a winter kill cover crop like radish. Let's see if I can there we go. So they have some great advantages. You just need to make sure you manage for them. And the point I want to make here goes back to timing, right? So that picture on the right, this was the tillage radish before. It was planted early, August 21st. We went around the next year and did all the exact same plots, but the planting date was, I think, exactly a month later. And you can see these pictures are both taken in the fall, right? If we want this to happen, we need this probably more than this. So how are we going to make that happen? We might need to adjust our crop rotations, right? So maybe we're growing corn silage followed by a winter cereal grain that we might harvest for seed. This farm started harvesting their own cover crop seed. And then that opens up a window in mid-July or August when we can be planting things like buckwheat, radishes, combinations and mixtures, legumes, right? All need to be planted earlier. And so looking at that. And then we don't have a lot of time here, so I won't dive deep on this. There's a link there below. And if you go to the e-commons at Cornell and just Google cover crop termination, this article comes up. Worked with Aaron on this one as well. But just this idea of flexibility. You have this cover crop, what are you going to do with it? You have a lot of options and there's a lot of situations, right? You might want to harvest or terminate early if we think it's going to be a really dry spring. You might be hoping to harvest or graze that as forage. You might terminate it before planting. And in this case, I think strip till into it. Planting green. You might be hoping to roll and crimp, and so there's some strategies you want to think of with that too as it gets later and later, or we might be leaving that cover crop as a crop itself and waiting until the summer, like I said, to harvest it as well. And so that article just kind of talks through the different things and considerations you need to take depending on each of those systems. But one thing to say is that in any given year, you might have, plan A, but you might need to be ready for plan B, which is where these might come in. And this is just a really good example of that. This picture, I will never live this down. I should not be smiling. The farmer was not smiling with that cover crop. So I'll talk about that real quick. But there are some challenges and troubleshooting that needs to happen as we add cover crops to our system. So herbicide is one. I think we've got that pretty well under control, but you can see now in this picture, right, we can see herbicide damage, especially as we start to diversify our cover crops. Make sure you're reading labels, make sure you're looking at carryovers and injury. Make sure you're paying attention to weather, all of that stuff. So if you've got systems, this is carryover from the herbicide in your cropping system that is injuring an early or even just a regular planted cover crop and creating issues for it there. So again, termination becomes pretty complicated. I covered some of that already, but right, if we don't do it right, it's going to impact our yields. And that's when farmers are like, nope, not doing that again, right? So this was actually 2 winter-killed cover crop plots, which, termination happened because of the weather. This was a triticale. Farmer did everything they were supposed to. They planted, they sprayed their glyphosate the day they planted, and then we just got a stretch of cool, wet weather, and that glyphosate couldn't do its job and set that corn back quite a bit by, a couple, 3 tons per acre at the end of the season. This flexibility piece, again, what you might not notice here, other than the really tall cover crop on 5.9, so this was not, it was not for the faint of heart. But what you might notice here is we were able to pull in a roller crimper on the no-till corn planter and rescue this cover crop, or actually rescue this corn crop. The farm had originally wanted to terminate early. Then they were going to harvest it as forage because they couldn't get it early. And this was a year where it just kept raining and raining and raining all spring. And we planted that corn on Father's Day that year and got actually a decent crop. So, and again, when we start to think about farms who complain about, I don't want that much biomass out there, right? We have tools available for that too. So I've started to see farms mix, we'll first use winter wheat, which is a lower biomass cover crop, mix it with things like oats and radish. Then you get, this is fall, really beautiful fall, good biomass. Then come spring, you're only dealing with 25 pounds of winter wheat, not 100 pounds of winter rye. So just being creative. But again, this was planted, second week of September to really get that kind of result. So again, just, in terms of species and mixtures, they can be challenging, but only if you're trying to plant them like winter rye, right? You just got to remember what your goals are. Make sure you're paying attention to timing, using good planting methods, and we can make those things work. And just like winter rye, right, the planting dates are going to be a little bit different for things like oats and annual ryegrass and radishes, let alone our legumes. You're going to be looking at late to mid-September instead of late August to mid-September instead of late September to October when we think about those mixtures. And then the last thing I have here, right, I could have made 18 slides about resources. We have a lot of resources. Like I said, your Soil and Water Conservation District folks on the call. This Managing Cover Crops Profitably book is pretty awesome. Aaron Risto's got some great resources on planting green and some case studies. I have a couple case studies that I've done. There's some cool tools now available. You can access all of these on the Northeast Cover Crop Council. But ultimately, I've learned the most from just working directly with producers that are doing really awesome things. And so just learning side by side with your farmers is the best way to go. And then I find like my job is just to share what they're doing and what's working. And actually, what's not working can be as valuable to share with other folks as well. So as long as people are willing to share what their flops were, that can be actually more informative even than what works well. So that's all I've got. I probably have time for a question or two, but I want to keep you guys on your agenda too. And I'm always happy to answer questions, and that's my contact information, and just really enjoyed the opportunity to get to share some of this with you guys.
Kirsten, thank you so much for that. That was terrific. Only some notes. I've got some questions of my own, but I'm also looking at the clock. I'm sure I'm not the only one in that boat. There was a lot of information there, and it is a very topical thing to be discussing, given the importance of carbon sequestration, water retention, and soil organic matter buildup.
Yep,
Um,
biomass.
Yes. Uh, maybe if we do have time for a couple of questions, I would open
Sure.
it up to the group because that's one of the benefits of having the meeting. So if anybody in the audience has a question, I try to keep it brief, but let's hear it.
Amanda has her hand up.
Just a quick question. Do you think that the added biomass and, from a nutrient management perspective, does the added biomass compensate for the added nutrients applied with manure? So are you taking up the nutrients that you're applying?
Well, if we're doing our C and P right, they should be already balanced. But if we're out of balance, one way to do that would be to harvest that cover crop. You would have an additional crop removal, right? So when we think about crediting, and we'll be talking about this a little bit at the CCA conference, right? If we don't harvest the cover crop, that nutrient still stays in the system. It's in a little bit more stable form, and becomes, more slow release, which is good, and can kind of match the timing. But if you're looking at kind of a field balance, the best way to do that would be to then harvest that cover crop to manage for that any excess nutrients from the manure itself. But mostly, like, I would say you're also sort of increasing infiltration and lots of other things, and you might end up seeing higher yields from those crops. And so the total system might be doing a better job about removing those nutrients. Because we do see yield increases if you do it right from both manure and cover crops.
Thank you, Amanda. Are there any other questions for Kirsten before we move on? I've got a question of my own, and I'll just put it out there. But in regards to termination,
Yeah.
is there a method that lends itself to more retention of biomass in the soil than another? Like, for example, planting green versus plowing under. I know that.
Yeah, so it will, the total will be the same in the end, right? You have biomass there unless you have some sort of loss, like it blows off with wind or leaves with runoff. If you incorporate it in the soil, it will decompose more quickly. If you leave it on the surface in a no-till system, you'll see that happen slower. But what I've noticed is with my farms that really adopt this whole soil health system, and others on the call may have seen this too, once that system sort of gets charged, it's amazing how much surface biomass disappears. Like I've been out there and like earthworms are like pulling leaves down into the soil, and you'll go out a month after planting and what look like, you might have a ton or 2 tons of cover crop biomass on the surface, and you'll go out there mid-season and it's gone. It's been utilized by the soil biology. So it's more about timing than about the total amount of carbon or organic matter in the system, I think. And so you'll see sort of delays or more quick releases from those systems, depending on how you manage it. But the more biomass you get, like if you wait and roll and crimp it, you're gonna have a lot of biomass. It's also gonna have a very high carbon and nitrogen ratio. And so it's gonna take a lot longer, and you might need to mitigate that early season tie-up with a little, like shift some of your nitrogen earlier in the season to help overcome that, and then back off on side dress because that system's gonna be giving you plenty of nitrogen later in the season.